Okay, both guys talked about working with forward air controllers. I was one of those forward air controllers, so I'm going to give you kind of our side of the story, okay? But I was never sarcastic with my fighter pilots. Here's what we're going to talk about. I was over there later in the war, 72 through 74, and again, we want to focus here a little bit on what was happening towards the end of the war. So I'm going to talk about forward air controller operations over there in that last 8-9 months or so. We're going to look at the FAC units in theater through 1972 so you understand the big picture. Residual ops in 1973 and the FAC ops in Cambodia or the Khmer Republic that last 6 months or so there. And you'll see now a larger spectrum of the war here. Let me throw up a map. Okay, our theater of operation was Southeast Asia. These guys talking about most of their missions that they were running were down here in South Vietnam. And I just want to remind you that during the war, we had 7 major bases in South Vietnam. We also had 7 major bases in Thailand over here from which we were flying. And oh, by the way, the United States Navy's out here with somewhere between 2 and 6 aircraft carriers. So we had lots of air power over there. Of course, the buffs are down here at Utapao flying the B-52 missions and all that kind of stuff. So we had a lot of air power over there. And for us airmen, guys like myself, this was really a theater war. And forward air controllers flew just about every section of the entire theater at some time or some point during the entire war. And our real mission, our #1 goal was presence. What does that mean? That means we were out there, we were up there, we were wherever we wanted to be. The enemy knew that, and because we were up there presenting presence over the enemy, they had to deal with us. They had to camouflage, they had to hide things, they had to build bunkers. They had to bring in extra guns to shoot at us and everything. So we were, wherever we were an encumbrance to the bad guys. We were friction for them, making their life a little bit more miserable, watching them. And to do that, needless to say, we needed to have air superiority because all those little facts flying around out there, wherever you were a flying target. And there were times throughout the war in Southeast Asia, which is what I call it, not just the Vietnam War, where MiGs would come up and try to knock one of us off like that. They would do it to the B-52s, they would do it to the gunships. It doesn't show up much in our history, but that was in fact the problem, air superiority. But what would we do? We would do visual reconnaissance. We would just get out there and fly up over the enemy and look and watch and observe, collect intelligence, because we were up there above them. We would also do search and rescue missions. Throughout the war, we had lots and lots and lots of airplanes shot down, thousands. And in many cases, the first person there to initiate rescue operations would be a forward air controller. Again, taking advantage of that idea of presence. This is still a factor today, I might add, in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. These same principles still apply. We ran a lot of search and rescue missions over there, starting with us. And back in our day, we called it search and rescue. Today we call it combat search and rescue. We call it personnel recovery. That's because we've learned a lot from Southeast Asia that we're doing today. We're a lot better about this today than we were in those days. Okay? What were we doing up there in our little fat airplanes? We were the link of air power to ground power. We were the intermediaries. When the fighters would come up, they could stick around for maybe 10 minutes or so. So we forward air controllers, we're out there for several hours. We know the situation, we know the threat, we know what's going on the ground. We can optimize our mission and situational awareness so these guys coming in can get their bombs on target where we need them. Okay, it was a bit of an art form. And we had 2 essential ways of using that power. As you've seen already, the F-100 guys were talking a lot about doing close air support. That's when you drop bombs in very close proximity to your friendlies. Forward air controlling is very critical at that point because I'm here to tell you folks, the bombs don't care who they kill. They're totally neutral. The idea is to put them on the bad guys, not on the good guys. That's called close air support. We also used our air power out there to interdict and attack enemy forces wherever we could find them. Places like in South Vietnam throughout, usually up in the mountains, certainly in Laos, along the Ho Chi Minh Trail where they were bringing their supplies down to the south. Up here in the north, we had another whole war going on up here over the Plain of Jars in northern Laos. In Cambodia, we were supporting the Allies down there. We were using air power in every portion of that theater, and the forward air controllers were the critical link to do that. And that secondary mission there called strike control and reconnaissance, we could do it. In fact, this is what our fastbacks were doing. They were doing SCAR, because they weren't putting in strikes around friendly units. They couldn't do that. So the mission was really SCAR, but fast SCAR doesn't sound cool. Fastback sounds cool. So that's why they got that call sign. And we used them all over the theater. We had U.S. forces initially throughout the war. We had 4 tactical air control squadrons in South Vietnam, each one in a different military region. 20th, 21st, 19th, 22nd task. And then up here in Thailand, where I was, right here, we had the 23rd Tactical Air Support Squadron, and we were flying missions all over this region over here. This was critical, again, because of the role of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, their supplies coming into the south. We also had the United States Marines. They had FAC squadrons over there. They had VMO 6 working with the 3rd Division up here, VMO 2 down here working with the 1st Division. They were some of our finest FACs. We were also using fast movers to perform the FAC mission for us. Why? Because in many places, the O1s that we're using, like this little guy up here, this little O1, the O2s, and even the OV-10s, could not survive because of the enemy threat. I had 100 millimeter guns shooting at me over Mugia Pass. I had 37 millimeter guns firing at me over the Plain Jars. And when you're flying an O1 at 95 knots, a 37 millimeter explosive shell, that'll get your attention. And so that's what we did. Fastbacks initially were the Marines, flying their F9s and their A4s, supporting their guys up along the Yellow Shore border. And then we started using our F100s initially to fly in the southern part of North Vietnam up here, and then later on along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Those were the Misty guys, some of the bravest guys you've ever seen. When they went away, we gave their mission to the F4 units, and we had outfits like Laredo, Storming, Wolf, Tiger, Night Owl, all those units flying fastback for us in the F4. And then they would roam all the way into North Vietnam, all the way over Cambodia. The fastbacks would literally be everywhere, providing primarily support for the SCAR mission, okay? Doing that, because they weren't working around friendlies. And throughout the war, we had several special units that worked specifically with different organizations. We had the Raven Fax in Laos. That's what this guy's doing up here. Notice that he's standing in front of an airplane with a Laotian marking on the tail. That's because under the Geneva Accords of 1962, we could not have military forces in Laos, except that the North Vietnamese never recognized that neutrality. They had their forces there. We had to be there fighting, therefore we did it covertly. The Raven forward air controllers were U.S. Air Force pilots. I did this for 6 months. We volunteered for the program. We went to Udon, took off our uniforms, turned in all our military gear, put on some main clothes, got on a CIA airplane, and flew to Vientiane, Laos, reported to the ambassador, and went to work for him in the air attaché. Doing exactly the same thing, but working with Laotian forces throughout the country. And again, part of our cover story was that we were up there, we were force rangers or something like that, and part of the covertness was we were flying O1s with Laotian markings on them. Okay, covert operations. We had to do that to support our allied forces up there, because we had as much war going on over here as we did in South Vietnam. There was fighting going on over there all the time. You just don't hear much about it. We had Mike Fax working with our MAC-VSOG troops, Army guys coming across the border into Vietnam to raise a ruckus along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, because the importance of all that. We were not allowed under treaty to bring our main force U.S. Army units into Laos and cut the trail, so we tried to do it with special forces. We were semi-successful. But in all of that, forward air controllers, in this case the Mike Fax, were supporting those ground units, providing that link between air power and ground power. Okay. FAC Ops in 1973. With the treaty that was signed, allowed us to operate as late as January in South Vietnam and as late as February in Laos. So in 1973, our forward air controllers were still fighting these battles up here. We were also patrolling the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and our Ravens were still working throughout Laos. And you'll see here, we lost a series of airplanes over there during all these operations. The last day in South Vietnam was 27 January. We lost an OV-10, 2 guys killed in action. We lost an F4 Navy guy. The front seater was killed. He had been the Blue Angels lead. and he was shot down in his last mission. That day, our guys that were over there knew the enemy was going to be blazing away at them with everything they had. So we told our guys, stay high, one pass for the fighters, don't put any more risk there, because we're trying to get our POWs and losses back. Unfortunately, we had a young, aggressive forwarder controller out there. He cleared those F4s in for multiple passes. On their third pass, they got bagged. They jettisoned out of the airplane. We never heard from the aircraft commander again, and they actually became a POW. The two facts themselves, there were 2 guys in the OB-10 that day. Both of them were killed on the ground. Not good. Okay, we're still operating in Laos until 27th of February. We lost 7 more airplanes over there. We lost an EC-47 with 8 guys killed in action. And we've never recovered any. Some of the guys got recovered, but most of them were lost. And then operations now, the treaty stopped fighting in South Vietnam, stopped fighting in Laos, but Cambodia, we were still operating there. We were supporting the indigenous friendly forces over there. So, no ceasefire. We had a detachment down here operating. Their call sign was Rustic Facts. They're doing their thing. They're fighting communist insurgents throughout the countryside. Our squadron up here, our call sign was Nail Facts. We started supporting them down there. And then, so the 23rd Task guys are going down there, and we're doing, we're also standing by. When we stopped flying under the treaty, we kept a residual force of fighters, bombers, and forwarder controllers here in Thailand to reinforce and enforce the treaty. I know we were Dr. Berman talked about this morning, how President Nixon had said, hey, if they do these violations, we're going to bomb, we're going to send in the B-52s. We had all kinds of operational plans to go back into Laos, attack the Ho Chi Minh Trail. We're watching it very closely. We're seeing the intel. The bad guys are streaming stuff down here like crazy, and we were itching to get at it. We were the residual force, okay, ready to go. So we start operating more heavily down here in Cambodia because we're allowed to still continue our air operations down there. And this is what Laos looked like after the ceasefire. You can see the heavy traffic down there. Is that an air power target or what? And of course, we're still fighting in northern Laos. This is an area called the Plain of Jars here. This is one of the main places where our Ravens were still operating up there. And we had lots of air power available to us. Of course, we've got the F4s here. Here's a F4D model taxiing out. You can see his ALQ-87 jamming pod here for the SAMs. He's got 12 Mark 82s on board. These have got fuse extenders. We call those daisy cutters. Very effective against soft targets like supplies trucks, people. Very effective. We used a lot of those. We had the A7s over there by that time. Here's a bunch of guys from Myrtle Beach. We had the Marine F4s over there still doing their thing for us, and lots of indigenous air. When I was over there, I worked with South Vietnamese Air Force, I worked with the Cambodian Air Force, I worked with the Thai Air Force, they were over there flying with us, the Laotians, all one big team. Lots of things going on. Okay, FAC Ops in Cambodia, 1973. These were the 3 primary airplanes we were using. This is my Squadron OV-10 here. This is another Squadron OV-10. You notice this airplane looks a little different. Right there, he has a laser designator. My squadron was one of the first squadrons in the Air Force to get involved with what we call precision weapons, paveway weapons, laser-guided bombs, okay? Really cool stuff. You can laser targets like I'm doing this right now, and the bomb would be dropped, and it had a little eye in its nose, and he had controllable fins in there, and the bomb would literally guide right to that target. So now, instead of having to call in a series of fighters dropping 12 bombs each one to try to hit one truck, now one laser-guided bomb takes out that truck. It was a revolution in military affairs, and we got to see that as young lieutenants back in those days. Realized immediately that we had something super cool here. Also, the airplane was equipped with a LORAN long-range navigational system. Here's the towel rack for the antenna there. And the engineers, when they put this thing together, they made it so that the LORAN could talk to the laser, and the laser could talk to the LORAN. Or in other words, I could zot a target and the lower end would give me the coordinates for that target. Now that was pretty impressive because Southeast Asia is a big theater with lots of hinterlands, and our maps were kind of old, and sometimes it was very difficult to determine the actual quote location of a target. And this gave us the perfect weapon to do that. And so they give us these airplanes, they tell these young lieutenants, take these airplanes and figure out what they can really do. Well, supposedly we're supposed to go out there and just start finding and bombing trucks, and the back seater of the OB-10 had a scope that we could look at the ground, and there was some magnification. We're supposed to find the trucks and destroy them. And they began to notice how effective this was to be able to spot those individual coordinates, because we had a search and rescue operation take place in a hinterland area of Laos, and it was hard to determine the coordinates of the survivor. The guys came up with the laser system, zotted it, and we knew exactly where his coordinates was. All of a sudden, now we have another asset for our search and rescue missions. So you give these toys to these young lieutenants, captains out there, you tell them they can do this, they'll show you what it can really do. And of course, over here we also had the AC-130 gunships out there working with us all the time. This is one of the most badass weapons we had right here. Extremely effective along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, but we also used them in Cambodia supporting our friendly. These guys could also support the SCAR mission, okay, strike control and reconnaissance. They could control air strikes from that platform too. This was one of the two most feared weapons by the North Vietnamese. They feared two airplanes, the B-52s and the AC-130 gunships. In fact, they referred to the AC-130 gunships as the Thug. You read their histories that they talk about. The thugs would come up at night and wipe out all their trucks on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Very effective.
I'm sorry, did you say thud or thug?
Thugs.
Thud.
T-H-U-G-S. Anyway, March surge, and the nails go down to Cambodia. We start flying up to 38 sorties a day. We start turning airplanes here at Phnom Penh and Sihanoukville down here. So we're given great coverage now to just about all of Cambodia. At the same time, up here in these hinter regions here, area called Freedom Deal, we got the fast facts coming down there doing their thing. So we had pretty good coverage that summer with our forward air controllers. Now this was almost exactly 50 years ago now. We also did a lot of convoy overwatch operations, okay, kind of interdiction in reverse, if you will, in that to supply the Cambodians, we were bringing supplies up the Mekong River, and of course the bad guys see this, so they would stage ambushes up here along the coastline, so we would cap these guys. Generally, we have a high OV-10, two lower OV-10s, one on each bank, and we'd be constantly running fighters along the shoreline there to defend these guys as they came up, and then we had gunboats working with us too. And you can see here's one strike going in down there. These were pretty effective operations. We also did direct support to the FANC, or the Cambodian troops. Your classic U.S. air support. Here's an OV-10 shot coming over our convoy down here. But we had a problem. We had no U.S. forces on the ground down there to advise and work with the Cambodians. We had to trust the Cambodians to give us all of our targets, our targeting information, and we found out later on there were a lot of other things going on down there. But we would do road escort, we would do classic interdiction, we would do recce, we would utilize and train the Khmer Rouge or the Khmer government air forces. And I did this a lot as forward air control. We had a guy down there working in the embassy. You might recognize his name, Mark Barrett. Okay, Mark was in the embassy down there, and he would talk to us on a daily basis and encourage us as much as possible to work with the Khmer Air Force, because they needed the training, because everybody knew we weren't going to be around much longer. So as much as I could, I would identify and mark targets for the Khmers and come up and let them do their thing. That was a key part. But there were problems with the entire campaign being led at that time by General John Vaught, who was the commander of 7th Air Force. And if you know your history, this is the guy that replaced General Lavelle when he was fired for supposedly illegally bombing the North. And that's a whole other story. Okay. Anyway, he said this was the most difficult campaign that he had to fight since he'd been commander of 7th Air Force. Now, think about that. Here we're fighting Cambodia, which is relatively low threat. This is a man who took us through all of the campaigns in 1972, Freedom Train, Pocket Money, Linebacker, Commando Hunt along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, linebacker 2, and he says this is his toughest campaign. Well, why? It's because of the political ramifications of all of this. We were fighting in a heavily populated area, high air traffic area for civilian aircraft. Lack of U.S. fighters on the ground to give us the intel we needed to be truly effective. Bad leadership on the part of the ground commanders, they got real lazy. They would not take any tactical moves until we went in and bombed the area for them first. They wanted us to do all the fighting. And of course, the fragility itself of the Fank Army. Okay? Challenges. They became over-reliant on air power. And that leads us to a very serious question. Did we bomb too much? Did we do too much? Were we in fact driving the civilians down there below us into the enemy through our overuse of air power? This is a very pungent question. And this is a question that's being investigated and researched by some very preeminent people in our country today, asking the question, did we overdo it? Did we overbomb? Because we were throwing sorties in there every day, and I'm going to show you some numbers here in just a second. We also lost some airplanes over that summer. You can see here's a OB-10 right on down through, and we were running the rescue operations that we actually lost on the 14th of June. We had an HH-53 holding over the Tonle Sap up here when he had a mechanical failure. The airplane started to fall out of the sky. The 2 PJs had parachutes on, and they jumped out, and they were saved. The rest of the guys were killed. And then we flew until the last day, 15th August 1973, and then after that, we came back to NKP up here in Thailand. The squadron stayed there through the summer of '75. They flew the Phnom Penh evacuations, supported the Saigon operations slightly, and then of course they were integral to the Mayaguez recovery, which occurred down here in one of these little islands down here. And if you recall that mission, we had a U.S. ship that was seized by Khmer Rouge elements down here and taken in there. The crew was initially taken hostage. Our national leadership ordered us to go down there and attack them and get those guys back. We sent some U.S. Marines in down there. We put a lot of U.S. air power down there. Things were going pretty bad until finally somebody realized, hey, we need that link between air power and ground power. Yeah, those 4 air controllers up at NKP, get them down here. They sent some down there. Within a few minutes, they had everything sorted out. They got all the guys back except for 3 Marines who were unfortunately left behind. And that episode was over. So we ended the war, the Vietnam War, our participation actually in the country of Cambodia. On the 15th of August, of course, we flew back to the squadron. There's the last sortie, the last day. This is the last force ship. That's me right there. We landed there, and here's my great squadron commander, Howie Pearson. Bill Powers was the OPSO. Charlie Yates was on the wing, and I was Blue 4 back here pitching out to make the last landing that last day. You just don't forget things like that. So let's talk about bombing. Here is the official history of the war showing all of the sorties that we flew in the Khmer Republic through 1973. Look at the numbers here. B-52s. July, we flew 1,200 B-52 missions. That's a lot. That's 40 B-52 missions a day. That's a lot of bombs. Each B-52 carried 27 tons of bombs. If it was a D model, you put them 3 together at a time. That's 81 tons of bombs in one airstrike. The targeting box for a B-52 strike was 1 kilometer by 2 kilometers. We can wield some air power. Did we overdo it? I don't know. You have the F-111s here. This is a B-52 strike going in here. You can see the devastation. You get some secondary explosions there. That's a lot of firepower. But that's what we did that summer, and unfortunately, we left a lot of Cambodia looking just like that. That's what air power will do sometimes. So you have to ask yourself, did we do it right? Did we overdo it? And as a member of those young airmen who did that, there were numerous times, I remember personally, when I was given targets by the Khmers, I looked down there and all I saw was civilians, and I would not strike those targets. And I wasn't the only guy who felt that way. Now the B-52 targeting, I don't know who was doing that, but we left a lot of the countryside looking just like that. So that's a quick look at the FACT mission and the role that we played, especially towards the end of the war, when those were our residual operations until Congress, in its wisdom, directed that we would cease combat operations on the 15th of August, 1973. So being the good airmen that we were, we followed our orders, so we flew back, went into Lauder there at NKP, prepared to do whatever missions that came up. I stayed in the squadron for about another 6 months or so before I left. But the good news is that while I was there, I met a young Air Force lieutenant who came over there as an intelligence officer, and she's been my wife now for 49 years. Any questions about forward air control? Neat little airplane to fly, the OB-10. I'll tell you, he is a young officer, very nimble. We could use it for light strike. We did a lot of our own striking, as a matter of fact. We had 5 sponsons on there that we could load on weapons especially in the Cambodian environment, which is relatively low threat. Sometimes we would load it with bombs. We could carry CBU. We'd load pods, and we would go out and do our own striking in support of our friendly forces. So that is a perspective of the forward air control operations. Yes, sir.
Sure, because I'm curious, how did the names like Misty Fac and Nail and that sort of thing, how did you come up, how did those get created?
Made them up.
Okay, I was just wondering if there's any, there's a story behind.
There probably is, but I mean, all of these call signs, these just kind of happened. Where did the Sandy call sign come from? Well, one of the guys that married and dated some girl named Sandy, he thought that was a cool call sign, so we started to use it. But a lot of these call signs that you hear now, Sandy, Jolly Green, I mean, these are very heroic call signs, and we use them to this day. In the A-10 community, as an example, later on after the war, a lot of the OB-10 bubbas went on into the A-10 community. So you, out there in the community, you'll hear the Raven call sign, you'll hear the Nail call sign, the Rustics, Jakes, all these are all call signs. Cubby is a very common call sign. So that's all part of Air Force heritage, and we carry those forward to this day. In fact, I bet you didn't know it, but the F-22s that shot down that balloon, you know what their call signs were that day?
Oh, it was
Frank and Luke.
Yeah.
Does that work or what, right? So the history never leaves you. So, yes, sir.
Did your OB-10, did it take any damage? Any ground water damage?
I was hit several times in the OB-10. On my second mission, on my first mission, I was fired upon by a radar-controlled 100-millimeter gun over Vancouver Pass. That was kind of scary. It was a radar-controlled gun. We could hear the radar because the radar tracking that they had there, they transmitted at about 240 megahertz. Well, sometimes their transmitters got a little sloppy, and sometimes we would literally hear the radar sound on our 243 guard receiver. And it was always an immediate signal that, hey, you've got a gun tracking radar out here looking at you. And I can tell you that when 100 millimeter airbursts go off, it's like 12 o'clock high. Big explosions. You want to get the hell out of there as quickly as you can. But the bigger, more dangerous guns were like the 23 millimeter high rate of fire, 14.5 millimeters EPUs, because they're putting up so many bullets all at once. And on my second mission in the OB-10, I was actually hit with a 23 millimeter round, and fortunately for me, and I was still flying with an IP, when the bullet came in the airplane, we saw the 23 millimeter going off below us. You can see it looks like CBU going off in the air. Long line of shells going off. One of the shells did not detonate. Instead it tumbled, and it hit the airplane in the left sponson there, and sideways, and it actually stuck in the #1 FM radio. And so when I got back to my base, I had a broken radio, and unfortunately I forgot to write up the airplane with a discrepancy. And our ops officer, just the day before, had scolded us, saying, "You guys are coming back with broken airplanes and you're not writing them up, maintenance can fix them." So, young lieutenant, okay, so I'm in the bar, right, trying to libate my way past this last mission, and the ops officer walks in, he goes, Whitcomb, who's Whitcomb? Sir, that's he said, "Did you fly 632 today?" "Yes, sir, I did." "Is anything wrong with it?" I said, "Yes, sir, the #1 Fox Mike radio wasn't working." "Did you write it out?" "No, sir." "You stupid shit, I told you." He's thumping me in the chest, and then he stops and he goes, "Well, what was wrong with it?" "I don't know." He said, well, would you believe maintenance just dug a live 23mm round out of it? And I went, no, and he went thump, and he laid it on the bar. Oh, shit. And the IP that I flew with, a guy by the name of Bill Royce, still has that shell, and he's really not sure. And then when I was a Raven flying the 01, I got shot up several times. There, it was a different environment in that we were flying much lower. And I actually got shot down one day by a guy with an AK-47. He put 3 rounds in the bottom of my airplane, and one of them went through the oil pan, and all the oil leaked out, and the engine went bang. And that's when I got real active on the radio. And fortunately, I was high enough working up in the mountains, I could glide out of the mountains and put the airplane down in friendly territory, which was very lucky for me because during that war, when you're flying as a Raven covertly like that, the enemy knows who you are. And there were, if you got shot down as a Raven, you either got picked up or you were lost. And we had no POWs for the Raven program up there. And fortunately, that day I got back to, I glided the airplane down. It was kind of cute. I took one round, came right through the right door, and it went through the back seat right there. And that day, I didn't have a back seater, so a lot of times I would fly with a Hmong interpreter in the back seat, and they could help us talk to the friendlies and all this kind of stuff. Well, that day I did not have a back seat, guy in the back seat, so when I put the airplane on the ground, and we got back to the airfield, and the bullet hole was right through the middle of the seat, and some of the Hmong tribesmen that I've been working with, they came out and said, "Oh, 25, how you doing, 25? That was my call sign, Raven 25. You okay, 25? And yeah, they all want to hear the story and everything, and then one of them looked in the back seat and saw that bullet hole that was right there. And boy, all their voices went up about this high, and every one of them had to come out and stick his finger through that hole. And then they said, okay, 25, we want to fly with you, 25. I said, what are you talking about? I said, you have good P, you very lucky. You take hit, no back seater, you very lucky, we fly with you. I figured that one out. So that's what we did as forward air controllers over there 50 years ago. It's hard to believe, but that's all part of our history. And the good news is, coming back from Southeast Asia, many of us ended up in the F-16 community, the A-10 community, and brought a lot of that tactical knowledge forward with us. And that then trained the generalist generation, and it just goes on from there. So there's something to this history stuff. It really is very valuable.